social theory.
All right, we are just waiting on the return of one more person, so
Yeah.
relax, hang tight, talk amongst yourselves.
Enjoy, yeah.
Enjoy this room.
But if you're looking to get a primer on social theory and journalism, we're going to not actually be talking about, like, social theory. We're going to be talking about other. Okay, sorry. Shh. Okay, well.
All right, so let's get started. Thank you for coming to the Social Theory and the News panel. I think it's going to be a fairly informal event today. We don't have any slides, so it's going to be largely a conversation amongst all of us, and then at some point, depending on time, possibly a conversation between us and all of you. So we will see how things develop. My name, thank you, yes, I'm pretty loud. My name is C.W. Anderson. I am a professor of media and communication at the University of Leeds. The rest of my wonderful folks up here, starting over here, Regina Lawrence at the University of Oregon, Nikki Usher, George Washington University, and soon to be at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and Charlie Beckett with Polis at the London School of Economics. A little bit of a framing for all of you, so you know kind of where this panel came from and where the idea came from. This was originally Claire Wardle's idea, Claire Wardle with First Drafts, and who's a regular participant, I think, in this event. And she and I sort of regularly would get together and kind of talk about, when we as academics kind of wax theoretical, in our finer moments, do any journalists care? And not only do they care, do they get annoyed? And given that social theory and that sort of thing is one of the things that academics do really well and is really important to us, should we be offended that journalists are offended, right? So, Claire and I sort of usually after a drink or two kind of have lengthy conversations about this. Unfortunately, Claire was not able to make it to this, but her spirit is with us, and we have a really fantastic group of people who are going to address some of these issues today. The way we're going to do it is that we are going to sort of pose questions to each other. So there's going to be no formal presentation. Each of us is going to kind of ask the other panelists a question. We will try to answer the question, have a bit of conversation. Depending on time, we may come back for a second round of questions. We may just sort of open it up as well. So that's what this is all about. And I would like to start off by asking Nikki, sorry. Yes, by asking Nikki Usher to sort of get us started. So Nikki, take us away.
So the first big question I have for the panel is, what can journalism research offer to journalism? And should it even actually be offering anything to journalism? So love to hear your thoughts.
I'm glad we're starting out with just a nice, simple, easy question. I guess one thing I would start with is to say, obviously there's a premium placed on research to the extent that it provides something actionable, seems to solve an immediate problem for newsrooms or for the news industry, and there seems to be far less interest on the journalistic side, at least from my perspective as an academic, far less interest in the theory that underlies or spurs any of that research. So to the extent that journalists become truly interested in social theory, I think we would have a lot to offer. But in my experience, many times journalists are averse to theorizing. They're suspicious of our methods and our approach and all of our abstract ideas. And it's hard to feel as though you're making much of an impact that goes beyond how to solve immediate problems.
You know, I would say, in my experience, journalists are suspicious of imprecise language, and they are suspicious of jargon, and they are suspicious of opaque thinking. And so, you know, and they sort of carry that attitude out towards politicians. They carry that attitude towards business executives. They carry that attitude toward, you know, towards celebrities, right? Journalists hate jargon, and they hate opacity, and they hate it when it sounds like someone is trying to talk around a question or not, you know, because they see that as fundamentally dishonest, right? If you're not straightforward, you are somehow being a dishonest person, right, by not answering the question. And so academia, I think, finds itself in a really kind of uncomfortable position, right, where on the one hand, theory is complex. The world is not a simple place, and I think that quite often journalists do tend to oversimplify the world a bit. They tend to think that the world is a bit more simple than it actually is. And academics don't think that way. They think that the world is complicated and there aren't easy answers. And so complexity is part of social theory. That said, social theory also has a problem, which is that for the past 20 or 30 years, it's kind of been captured by people who place a premium on not being able to write well. You know, so you know, there is actually value added to not being able to communicate in an intelligible way, and that's actually rewarded by the professoriate. You know, so to the degree that that is true, we also have ourselves to blame, right? So you know, I think there's a tension between this idea that yes, the world is complicated and it is not always as straightforward as journalists like to think, while at the same time we do ourselves a disservice by deliberately talking in ways that, you know, very, very intelligent people, and every journalist I've met is really, really smart, that really intelligent people can't understand. And then this is a trigger thing for journalists, right? Because they hear this and all they hear is some White House press secretary not answering the question, right? So, yeah.
Oops. I'd like to do my favourite thing, which is to talk about myself, simply because I'm somewhat different, I guess, from the colleagues here in that, you know, I was a journalist and I was hired by the London School of Economics because I wasn't an academic. And I ended up I am now a professor, but let's keep this between ourselves, but I don't have a PhD. I don't have a doctorate. So I can't be a professor at the London School of Economics. They had to create a special category of professor for me. I'm a professor in practice, which I like that because it implies that at some point I'm going to be quite good if I keep practicing. But I represent something, in a way it's a success story, not just because I'm fantastic at my job, but it's a change in the last, it's so loud. I think there's been a big change. I mean, whatever my colleagues say, it's true, but it was much, much worse 10 years ago, when before journalists, I mean, it's literally an insult. A journalist would say that is academic, meaning it's irrelevant and opaque. And likewise, academics would say, oh, that's very journalistic, meaning, you know, simple-minded, uncomplex, etc. So they're kind of mutual insults. And yet, over the last 10 years, I think, partly because of the efforts of academics to engage more, and partly, frankly, because journalism is in deep trouble and needs help from anywhere that it can get it to help rethink the changes that it's going through. And, you know, my project as a think tank was a deliberate attempt to create a space where journalists could feel safe to come into a university. And likewise, a space where, you know, researchers can bring their insights and their understanding into contact with those journalists. So I don't think it's been all bad, and I actually think the differences are also very healthy. I have really enjoyed being in an environment where people have a theoretical approach. It lifts you away from the detail. It takes you away from the, and obviously journalism is about the day-to-day, the week by week. So it enables you to have a more structural approach to not just journalism as a practice, but journalism as it's situated, within society and within markets and within politics and other systems like that. So I personally have really enjoyed that setting of social theory. I still haven't quite worked out what mine is. I had a long conversation a couple of years ago with my head of department because I had to have a theory. What's your approach, Charlie? And so I was kind of describing my approach, and in the end he said, okay, you're a phenomenologist, which apparently just means the study of things.
That's a good thing.
And I thought, well, that's just journalism. so anyway, I'm optimistic, but I agree it's a sort of continual struggle.
So I'm going to get academic. So it's probably worth explaining kind of how communication research and how journalism research became part of the academy. And so a lot of communication as a discipline was really out of response to trying to understand, how was Hitler, right? Was Mussolini, right? Was their use of mass media part of what got people to, do all of the things that happened in World War II? Was there some sort of reaction? You saw this powerful media, and then you became a hateful person, right? Was that actually a real effect? And then conversely, in the United States, right, there's this big war after World War I. Now there's World War II, not on our soil at the beginning. How do we use media? Are there positive ways to use media to bring people together, right? So the Battle of Britain is one of these historic films, in part because it was created as propaganda in an effort to convince American soldiers all over the country to come together in a common cause. So the very foundation of communication research in its modern incarnation, right, because people have been studying rhetoric for a really long time, has been practical, right? But part of that practical research has also been to try to understand explanatory mechanisms that go beyond that particular case, right? And so this has sort of been the tension. It got called administrative research, Katz and Lazarfeld, if you guys have ever heard those names, right? Doing research for the sake of profit, commercial practice, versus sort of pure academic research with no applied bent to it, right? So there's been a tension in the field to the present that I think continues. And so I think it's just worth having that background. And so bringing that up to today, I had the chance to talk to Craig Newmark yesterday at this conference, and he's launched the Truth Integrity Project, or something of that name. And if you look on the list of people contributing, there are no active tenured track faculty on the list of the advisory board. And so I was giving him a little bit of grief for that. And I was like, I have a data set. I've got, media effects research that I can share with you. I can show you how information flows through the political system. And Craig says, you have a data set? Right? And so this is sort of the situation we find ourselves in, where we have the explanatory mechanisms for a lot of current pressing social phenomena, but lack the ability to really integrate that into the questions of the day, I think, in a really broad and convincing way. So hopefully that's helpful to you guys.
Great. I'm going to ask a follow-up question based on the opening kind of conversation. And so, before we go on to you, Regina. So my follow-up would be, what is the relationship between social theory and critique? Right? When we talk about social theory, to what degree are we talking about what is known as critical social theory, right? And so to bring another name into this, critical social theory usually comes out of what's known as Western Marxism and the sort of Germanic, critique of the Enlightenment and critique of capitalism that emerged, you know, in the years before and after World War II, right? And this came from people like Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse and folks sort of from that school of scholarship, right? And the idea behind critical theory, I mean, not to simplify it too much, was that basically, you know, you criticize everything. You know, that most of what's happening in the world is, I'm being somewhat unfair, but, you know, to generalize a bit, right? That most of what's happening in the world is, you know, sort of a collusion between capital and, you know, kind of fascism, right? That will sort of, you know, lead the world in a bad direction. And again, deeply simplifying, right? But there's a highly critical edge to this social theory, right? And a lot of that element has been taken up by the academy. So my question would be, let's not only talk about journalists' relationship to social theory, but journalists' relationship to social theory. And do you guys think that journalism dislikes that criticality in some way or another?
And then he turns the mic to me. Okay. I'm trying to say something intelligent. One thing I was struck by, okay, so I'm dodge your question for a second. In our opening conversation, I was struck by how you said that journalists dislike imprecision and imprecise words. And I know that for myself, every time I'm interviewed by a journalist, I have the same frustration as feeling as though they're being imprecise in not seeing the complexity of a situation or not being willing perhaps to dig a little bit deeper instead of just going for that quote that fits the story perhaps they've already decided they're going to tell. And I think in the same way, journalists, most of the ones that I've known, really fancy themselves to be critics, right? I mean, that's really at least in the United States, that's really the fundamental position, is that we don't take anything for granted. What's the old phrase, you know, don't take somebody's word for it until you've checked it out two or three times. Yeah, exactly, check it out, right? So they kind of fancy themselves critics, and yet I think in a similar vein are very averse to deeper critique, particularly if it involves the profession of journalism and kind of the daily practice of journalism. And of course, that's hard. It's hard for any of us to be, you know, reflective about our own daily practice. That's tough. But I guess that's my take on your question, is that I think, yes, I mean, most journalists that I've interacted with have been averse to too much theorizing no matter what, and averse to critique that runs too deep, if you will.
And too close to what they do.
And too close to what they do, yeah. I feel like I'm painting with too broad of a brush,
We're
but
all
we'll get into more
So
nuance,
I mean,
I hope.
I think that there's a worthwhile separation between the journalism/communication researcher and our position relative to journalists versus sort of other domains of academic expertise like political science and economics, right? And to a lesser extent, sociologists, right? So those studies get covered with, you know, significant, right? Or just sort of scientists, right? Hard scientists. Those studies get covered with regularity, right? A political scientist or an economist has some finding about the relationship between gender and a wage gap. Boom, that's an easy story, right? I produce something about, say, vaguely practical, right? About the role of analytics in a newsroom and how it's affecting editorial judgment. And that will never see the light of day unless I go myself to then write a briefing for CJR or Neiman Journalism Lab or journalism.co.uk, right? So there's an extent to which journalists think they understand what they're doing and don't really, on some level, respect the researcher of journalism unless we can solve their immediate financial problem.
And we're going to get back to that.
And I think that's, you know, it's not unique to journalism or journalism studies, as it were. That tension between, as you say, there's the kind of utilitarian research where you're looking at the real world today, and your findings obviously have relevance to people who are also, you know, working in that real world. And then, of course, there is, as you say, the more critical theory approach. But this isn't unique to just journalism. When I think of economics, for example, you know, I'm at the London School of Economics, and famously, after the 2006-07 crash, the financial crash, Her Majesty the Queen while visiting, she was opening a building a couple of years later at the LSE, and she was introduced to all these professors of economics, which is, the highest rated economics department in the world, I believe. And she asked them, why didn't you see it coming? Why didn't you tell us this was going to happen? And basically their answer was, well, in 10 years' time, we'll have worked through, what happened, and we'll work through the theoretical implications of this. And that isn't their job. Their job is not to run banks. Their job is to critique it and theorize it. And it's a fantastic department. It makes a lot of money. And I think there's a similar thing with journalism. We have this discussion, for example, about should you go to J school to be a journalist? My answer, subjectively, is no, you shouldn't, particularly. But if you really like journalism, then just study the thing. It's really interesting. I don't run a journalism school. We teach people to think about journalism. And at that point, critical theory is very, very helpful. Otherwise, you're merely, describing the object as you found it. Where I think there's a problem, going to Chris's point, where I think there can be a problem for journalists when they're being critiqued, is not just the complexity business. I mean, that's obviously the point of journalism, is that it's supposed to simplify things. That's the whole point of journalism. So to criticize it for simplifying things is ludicrous. That's what it's supposed to do. Likewise, it's the opposite. When journalists complain about, the complexity, and I always say there are two standard responses at the LSE to any sort of difficult question that you're asked. One is to say, it's political. That always looks good. And the other one, of course, is to say it's more complicated than that, which is another way of saying more research is needed. But one of the problems, I think, sometimes around the quality of critical theory is that there can be a tendency to describe something as critical theory, which is really ideological bias. And I feel that so much of critical theory is really a critique of journalism not being left-wing enough. And I think that's something that, again, journalists can find difficult, if you like, about the critique, which is, God, you're neoliberals, or God, you're capitalists. Well, that's no news to somebody working in a commercial news organisation. So I think that there can be that distancing effect of some critical theory.
We'll come back. I want to come back to that for sure, but I also know that Regina wants to get a bit more specific, and so do I. So let's turn it over to your question, Regina.
Sort of following up on an earlier observation that you had made, Charlie, about the kind of the role of academic centers that are welcoming to both journalists and practitioners. I've become very interested in centers around the US and UK and other places that are really devoted to that, and they're either interdisciplinary or not particularly disciplinary at all necessarily, right? So I'm thinking of everything from, the Tau Center, the Nieman Lab, the MIT Media Center, there's so many to name, Reuters Institute, the center that I direct at the U of O, the Agora Journalism Center, which in various ways really are trying to solve some of the practical problems of journalism. And I think that I'm wondering what you think, all of you, about the kind of tension that's built right into that work. Because on the one hand, these centers exist because we want to help journalism to do better. And it might be do better economically, find a way forward in the future for business models, figure out what to do with tech, social media, et cetera. It might be innovation in practice, which is, for example, what we focus on at Agora, trying to figure out new ways to engage the public, to sort of rebuild trust if that's possible. So there's a tension built right in, because as an academic, and I'm a little bit of a weird academic actually, because I'm like super averse to too much theorizing. I'm a little bit more like a journalist, I suppose, in that way, that I have always valued most the research that is illuminating, but helps me understand what's happening now. That's been the kind of research that I have valued and that I've tried to pursue. But I do think that there's a tension, because for a lot of academics, you know, we're not going to proceed in our careers if we don't produce the theoretically rich, kind of even groundbreaking, or certainly theoretically grounded work that is more heavy on the theory than it is on the practical, you know, how to solve problems side. And at the same time, we can only be relevant to journalists, it seems, if we do kind of speak that language of applied problem solving. And so I guess what I'm getting at is these centers and the reports that we've all been producing and the work we've all been doing seems like it could be creating new common ground, or at least a new meeting place to address some of these differences that we're talking about. So I'm wondering your impressions on that.
I can do it.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, and I was hesitant to speak first, but, you know, to me, that's all completely correct. And I think, but it's all completely correct, and it's been a huge change in the last, I mean, I remember sitting at Columbia University when they were, you know, debating the idea of the Tau Center there, and, you know, and no one really knew what the heck they wanted. No one knew what the heck they were doing. No one had any idea what this Tau Center would look like, and all they knew was somebody said, we want a Berkman for journalism. You know, we want a Berkman Center for journalism. That's what people said. And Berkman, for those of you who don't know, is sort of the famous Internet and Society, you know, research center at Harvard. So it's sort of the first one, right? That's what Berkman was. And so everybody at Columbia said, you know, well, we want a Berkman Center for journalism. And they didn't know anything beyond that, right? They just sort of knew that was seemed like a good idea. And so now you have this situation where you have, as Regina said, these are like a field where it just rained and there are these mushrooms popping up all over. I mean, the change in this space in the last decade is really remarkable. And if you're all interested, I would recommend a blog piece on a website called Culture Digitally by a colleague of mine, Jeff Pooley, Pooley. And Jeff kind of runs through the history of these research centers over the last decade and a half. So the but, though, is the money, right? I mean, that's the but. The but is where the funding comes from, what the funding requires, and what happens when the funding goes away. And so the deal with all of these research centers, right? Reuters, Tau, MIT Media Lab to a lesser degree, Oxford Internet Institute, you know, to a lesser degree. You know, I think Polis is different, Charlie. I would love for you to speak to this. But by and large, Berkman is this way. By and large, those centers don't get their money from undergraduates. There's no tuition involved, right? And so, you know, the deal with tuition is it's a lot like newspaper subscriptions, right? When you have a newspaper subscription, it gives you know, when you have a large subscriber base, you can kind of have a lot of freedom to sort of do whatever you want because you have this regular sort of income coming in that allows you a certain degree of freedom, right? And the difference is that, you know, if you aren't getting money to do your thing from undergraduate tuition dollars, someone else has to pay the bills, right? And quite often the people paying the bills are one or two very large foundations, sometimes one or two very large commercial organizations, the Googles, the Facebooks, right? Increasingly, the Googles and the Facebooks sort of as a PR maneuver see it important to sort of fund academic research, right, to show that they're taking the problems that they caused seriously, and, you know, they want to, you know, claim that they're interested in finding solutions, right? I mean, you know, anyway, you know, so that is the trouble, right? The trouble is that the money's got to come from somewhere. So then the question is, what constraints does the money put on you, if any, and what happens if and when the money goes away?
Yeah. Yes. What happens when the money goes away? I mean, you're right, Chris. Polis is slightly different. It was actually, it came from an idea from Tony Giddens, interestingly, who quite presciently realised that, you know, journalism had to be, journalism as an industry had to be brought into academe because it was so critical to society and democracy and so on. And the LSE did it in a very strange way. They it's been worked out as it's gone along. You know, they hired me in, and it is actually funded by student fees. In effect, I'm paid for, and our very small team is paid for by the LSE. So it's paid for by students, in effect. But that also means that it's quite restricted, and that if I want to actually go and do anything, I have to fundraise, you know. So at that point, I have the similar challenges to everybody else. But I do think it's interesting, and you're quite right, that there has been this, especially in America, of course, because there is more foundation funding, and frankly, you know, the media organizations, including the tech companies, are much bigger and richer than they are in Europe. Although, obviously, in places like Germany, you have a very strong foundation culture as well. But it's interesting that we've had to create these new institutions, these sort of hybrid spaces, because I think on both sides, obviously there's the journalism industry is notoriously time and attention poor when it comes to looking at itself or thinking of wider society. But also academia, as Chris has alluded to, there's the career structure of individual academics is not conducive to engaging with industry. You don't get paid extra for doing that. I mean, you do it as part of your research, one hopes, but there is very little incentivization to do this. And also, other structures like departments. Regina, you mentioned quite rightly that journalism by its nature should not be left to journalism departments. You know, it's about politics, it's about democracy, it's about society. And yet, you know, university departments are notoriously walled off silos. It's hard enough to get my department to collaborate with another department, never mind with another university or with the industry. So you have to create people like me and roles like me and little units that are distinct and separate, and the Tower Centre is a fantastic example. I mean, as I say, some of my best friends work at the Tower Centre and Columbia. I think they are absolutely exemplary, they're wonderful. But can you think of anything more ludicrous in the 21st century to set up a digital journalism centre that is separate from your journalism centre? I mean, it's bonkers, as we say, you know. But it certainly worked. And so, yes, we do have to create these new structures.
And I can guarantee you it would have not worked any other way.
No, exactly.
But to be a professional gadfly here, it seems like journalism is late to the center party. If you look at, say, my school has a mind-brain behavior center, right? And the goal is to bring in people from the community who are suffering from Alzheimer's and, Parkinson's and various other sorts of issues that are fundraised outside the university to come up with cures for Alzheimer's, right? It's a direct engagement with the community and with medical practitioners to come up with better solutions. I think about the speech and language center at my university. I can come up with like maybe 10 different centers that are positioned as public-facing centers that engage in various practitioner community dialogues that have a long history, right? And so the question is actually, why has it taken journalism so long? Right? The conflict over who funds us, I mean, that's been an ongoing conversation in the sciences for decades, right? And so I think it's actually worth noting that what has it taken to this point to get journalists to realize that research is important when in every other social field, research has been part of the conversation from the inception. So I think that's sort of my pushback on this a little bit.
Come back on that, just because I think it's sort of a question, really. Is it possibly because, and I think this is in a way a good thing, that whenever I look at journalism, obviously I spend most of my time in newsrooms and talking with journalists. So of course I'm looking at journalism as a set of practices. But I always describe, when people say, what's your think tank? It's actually a journalism and society think tank. So we always look at journalism and politics, journalism and gender. There's always that and bit. And in some ways, I wonder if it should be dissolved, that you should sort of experiment by not having a journalism centre, that journalism should be For example, at LSE, we have loads of different centres. We have cities, a cities institute. Well, journalism is a vital part of understanding how cities work. So you should have the journalism bit should be in the cities department. It should be in the economics department. It should be in the Institute for European Affairs. And in some ways, that's sort of what I've done. It's very difficult to cross those departmental boundaries, but certainly with the centres, it's easier. You can say, can I insert a little bit? So, for example, I've been obviously working with the US Centre at the LSE because of you know what, you know who I'm talking about. So they're suddenly interested. They're suddenly interested in journalism, and social media, of course. Because it's a convenient way to blame America for Donald Trump. So perhaps it's that there's a sort of thought experiment that you'd say, let's not have a journalism centre, let's try and invade everyone else's centres.
I know Regina wanted to jump
I just want to weigh in on that quickly, because I think here's yet where another paradox, conundrum, tension comes in, because on the one hand, there's real benefits of being based in a department, and I was struck by your use of the term ludicrous for a center that doesn't exist within a department. And at the same time, truth be told, not all schools of journalism are the most forward-thinking places, right? And so there's a real tension there as well, right? If you want to push forward, ask new questions, think of things in different ways, connect things that haven't been connected in the same way before, you may or may not find a happy home in a school of journalism, at least in the U.S., to do that.
Charlie, did you have moving on, did you have a question you wanted to, a burning question you wanted to pose to all of us? Or?
Well, the facile one, which we've sort of answered really, was why worry about this? In the sense that what is, critically at stake? I can understand the frustrations on the part of the academics, and I can understand, the confusion, if you like, on the other side. But it is interesting to think about what do we think is missing? What is not happening because of this? We'd all love it if people paid more attention to our research, although then there's that danger that the expectation is that your research has to have an impact. And this is now literally a big issue in higher education in the UK, where we're sort of catching up with America in this sense that you literally have to demonstrate impact as part of the, the research evaluation framework, and of course my colleagues hate this. I think, you're being paid fabulously well, as a whole, not individually. There's a lot of money going into higher education, research and teaching. It's expanded greatly, so it's not surprising that people are sort of saying, well, what have you done for me lately? But I can also see that if you insist on that too strictly, you kill the very creativity, the critical distance and so on, that is ultimately useful. So I'm just sort of thinking, what are we missing? What are journalists not doing that they should be doing if only they had read your last journal article?
So, like many Americans, after 2016, I may have had a crisis of faith, which I think is a unique American privilege, right? For an American to say, oh my gosh, what is happening to my democracy? That is a very unique American privilege, right? To be able to ask that question and have never asked it before. So I think just sort of putting that out there. But my personal crisis of meaning was, oh my gosh, I was talking about these questions of false equivalence. I've been thinking, and so have many of my colleagues, have been thinking about these enduring problems, not related to journalism and technology, but how journalism actually gets done, the flaws and weaknesses in journalism's capacity to tell stories well. These are things that have not changed since research into news work began in the 20s. If you go back and read Walter Lippmann and his critiques from 1922 about journalism and the publicity man and PR, right, the rise of PR, right, all of these critiques are deeply trenchant. And I find it fascinating that the Hutchins Commission, which was created in the US sort of after World War II to assess whether journalism had become overly profitable and lost its way and wasn't trusted anymore, is essentially the same discourse that is being found in the Knight Commission, right? And so I think for me, the big issue is not can we solve some innovation issue, but actually, I feel rather useless at times because there are these enduring, endemic practices of journalism that no research will ever really be able to change. So if you can solve my existential dilemma, I'm welcome to it.
I mean, I just have a side thought, not really answering Charlie's question, although I might come back to it. But, you know, on impact, though, I mean, so, and I just love this conversation. So Rasmus Cleese-Nielsen and Rasmus is at Reuters, had this conversation about impact. And, you know, Rasmus is a fairly intellectual guy, for those of you who know him, but he's also a fairly pragmatic guy. And, you know, I was sort of complaining about impact, right? I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they make us demonstrate all these metrics about how our research is meaningful and what, you know, this is crazy, this is completely out of control. And, you know, Rasmus sort of looked at me and he said, well, Chris, you know, there's a lot of things that the government can spend money on. The government can spend money on roads, on public transit, on the NHS, on defense, on many, many other things, you know, he said. And so why should the government spend its money on supporting you if you can't claim that you're actually doing anything? Because there's a lot of other things that need doing. You know, like, it's not as if there's an unlimited amount of taxpayer money to just kind of go for whatever social problem in the world we want to solve. You know, there's a limited amount of funding that, you know, that exists. And so to ask you to sort of justify that every once in a while is possibly not too much to ask. And this was so inherently not the way I think at all, temperamentally. It really, you know, as you can tell, it really took me aback, but then it really got me to kind of, you know, I thought it was a great question because it really got me to think about, you know, well, hey, that's a good point. What would I as a taxpayer want to spend my money on? Maybe I would actually want to be able to go to the NHS without having to, you know, wait as long as I do, right? Is it better to fund that than, you know, some paper? Yeah.
I think it's interesting that there is an analogy in newsrooms. You know, that when newsrooms look at, I don't know, they've got 50 journalists in a newsroom and you know, Nikki has studied these people and they're saying, well, how much content have you produced today? How many clicks have you had today? And if they did that in a super rational way that looked at impact and productivity, they would probably get rid of their investigative journalists, for example. And yet it's clear, good news organizations understand that, for example, you know, an investigative journalist is valuable to the brand overall, even if they don't necessarily churn out vast amounts of content every day. So I think there is some, and it is something that perhaps universities have to work harder at, and they'll often be surprised. I was struck, we had an advisory group for my department, so a bunch of people from, you know, big farm, PR, you know, real people, sort of in the media world, but not particularly journalistic at all, and not particularly noble people. And the one thing they kept saying was, don't be too utilitarian. They said, we can do that. Do you know what? We're quite good at looking at how PR works or advertising works. We are the experts on practice. We much prefer you to create a bunch of students who will then go into the workplace or create research with critical, independent thinking. You know, surprise us, be different. That is your role. Your role is not to tell us day by day what to do. And I think one of the great, certainly from my point of view, one of the most useful functions of academics is a kind of myth busting. It's like you've just done, she's just done it, where she looked back at history and said, you know, we've had these problems before, or we've had versions of them. We've had technological change in the past, and there are these series of reactions that you get, moral panics, etc. And I think that is a very, very useful function of trying to define the problem rather than always trying to solve it. And you'd be surprised. When I go and talk to my colleagues in the industry, that's the bit that they often find most useful. They don't need me to tell them how to design their app. They, although often they are very interested in, for example, audiences especially. They're very interested in audience. But they like that idea of people saying, no, think about this strategically, think about it in a broader context, because you might be rushing off in the wrong direction. And the classic example, of course, is the whole panic around so-called, I'm calling it so-called so Claire doesn't get cross with me, so-called fake news. And this is why we're doing our commission on truth, trust and technologies, partly because we're bringing people in from the industry to talk about it and from society. But it's also because my academic colleagues are absolutely brilliant at saying, well, what really is the problem around disinformation at the moment? Is it any different to previously? And if so, how? So thinking about defining the problem before you try and solve it, I think is a vital role for you guys.
Regina, did you want to?
Oh, I just wanted to be sure and circle back around to 2 points that I think have already been made, so I won't go on and on. But one is we've spent a lot of time this morning talking about what maybe journalism and newsrooms need to do differently, but what does academia need to do differently, right, in order to really value this kind of research? And at least every school and department that I'm familiar with in the United States, a junior faculty member would not get tenure based on merely producing applied research that didn't have a strong theoretical foundation of some sort. So, and for myself, I would say that that's appropriate, because where else, if not in higher ed, to ask the bigger questions and build social theory? But I do think it's part of the problem. And then I just wanted to echo Nikki's frustration, the sense of does our work make any difference at all? Funny anecdote about that for me was having written a book about Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign, then being approached by the publisher to write sort of a second version of the book for 2016, since it was clear that she was going to be probably the nominee again. And my co-author and I thought about it for a minute and decided we didn't want to because we thought it would be boring. We thought 2016 was, like many people did, probably Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush or someone like that. And part of why I thought it would be very boring is I felt like we'd be documenting all the same patterns that we had documented 8 years earlier with respect to the role of gender stereotypes, with respect to the false equivalency that's created between two candidates. Do I regret that decision? Yes, but I just wanted to echo your frustration.
I had a question, but there's also a lot of wisdom in this room, and we have about, we have about another 15, 20 minutes or so. So I would like to open it up to all of you guys to dialogue with us, and I also have another question I'll come back to if you all are rendered mute and speechless. So raise your hand. I don't know most of your names. I will try to call on you and just, is there a mic? Is there an audience mic? All right, so I know you, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hey, is this working?
Yeah.
I really like this kind of phrase from... Sorry, I'm Jonathan Gray at King's College London. Good, sorry. Bruno Latour, sort of French sociologist, has this phrase that he has this kind of mistrust of interdisciplinarity. And one of the moves that he makes that I really like is to kind of look at the conditions under which interdisciplinarity works. And that's often used to describe collaborations between different academic fields, such as, for example, when there's a shared object of study, when a discipline runs up against the limits of their disciplinary knowledge and realizes there's another field which has done that really well. And I feel that several of the developments around digital media, like around, for example, so-called fake news and misinformation, on the study of platforms and platform data, have created common objects of concern between researchers and journalists. I guess my question is, do you have any thoughts, and this is very much an area of ongoing experimentation, about how we can move from that position of having a shared object, which could be a really nice opportunity for more substantive collaborations, to building out on there's such fantastic work in internet studies and platform studies which look at what platforms do, and at the same time we see kind of Mark Zuckerberg even this week, and kind of journalists trying to cover that, and the sort of platformization of the web, and the like economy, of which there has been sort of excellent research over the past few years. But I guess I'm thinking, how do you move from the kind of common objective concern to common approaches and narratives and more substantive collaborations?
I mean, I don't know if you should, I guess, would be my answer. You know, so, you know, and that's just me. I mean, who was this? Bill Dutton had a great analogy he made. So Bill Dutton is a scholar, used to be the head of the Oxford Internet Institute, and is a scholar now at Michigan State. And Bill Dutton had a distinction he made between question-driven disciplines and theory or results-driven disciplines, right? And so a theory-driven discipline is one that takes a theoretical starting point as its beginning, right? Like you wanna demonstrate the working out of some larger social trend, or you wanna demonstrate the working out of some underlying social mechanism, or you wanna demonstrate, something big and holistic, right? And the other one is a question-based, sort of approach, where it's not quite that you start with the object, but you start with a question, right? And the question is, for instance, what is the role of the public in a world where it is difficult to tell truthful information from false information, right? And he argued that journalism studies and communication studies, to a lesser degree, has always been a question-based discipline rather than another type of discipline. And I quite like that, actually. I mean, I don't know, if I would want to. So it's not quite saying the object, but it's saying, let's start with questions. Let's start rather than with theory, rather than with methods, right? So academics start with theory, they start with methods, or they start with questions. And my training always emphasized the question. Where I got my PhD was obsessed with forget the methods, forget the theory, start with an interesting question. And if you have an interesting question, you will do interesting research. So, yeah. If anybody else wants to.
Just very, very quickly, just to say, I love that thought from Bill. But also, I agree that, I don't think it's quite what you meant, Jonathan, but in a way, we don't want too much common ground. One of the problems has been, both in academia and obviously in the news media, that there's been too much kind of groupthink and a kind of complacency around even what the key questions are. And I think we, if anything, need to do what we were talking about earlier, about trying to draw up from other disciplines and other ways of thinking, not just theoretical ways, but other disciplinary approaches to thinking about what journalism is and what it does,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, and introduce yourself if you would as well.
Stand up.
Okay.
My name is Mariana Thomas. I used to be a journalist. Now I work for Forum Journalismus and Medienwien in Vienna. I organize seminars for journalists on foreign topics. I have a very non-academic question to Charlie. You mentioned at the beginning that the critique of journalism is not left enough. I would like to ask you, is there a theoretical explanation of why most traditional legacy media of quality, like the New York Times or The Guardian, Le Monde, El País, La Repubblica, and so forth, why they are left of center? Thank you.
I thought you were going to ask me why academics were left of centre. The obvious answer to that is they're unemployable. Just kidding.
No, that's
just
true.
kidding. Yeah. And what does that say about me if I've been thrown out of journalism? Yeah. I'm not sure that's true. Firstly, I come from a country where our newspapers, at least, are largely right-wing. And obviously it depends where you define left and right. But I mean, you're partly asking the other question, which is, are journalists instinctively more liberal, lefty sort of thing? And that's supposedly, I think again, actually, it's the unemployable thing. They're not able to do anything else. But it's supposed to be that it's a craft that's more curious and more questioning I'm idealising. This is the person who would answer this much better than me, really. But I'm not absolutely sure that. The other great work on this is by Reuters. There is good research on this by Nick Newman and Reuters, who they asked people in different countries where they put their media on a political spectrum. And it was fascinating because, of course, it was very different. In America, the graphic visualization was two little mountains on the left and the right. In the UK, it was more of a kind of pile, that sort of spread left and right. In Germany, it was huddled directly in the center, There weren't many people who thought their media was left-wing.
Yeah, so I think this is a very good question that gets at the heart of what is journalism as a profession, what is its normative position relative to power, which is ultimately what Chris is saying, critical social theory. How do we interrogate power? Historically, right, news has been more right-leaning than left. I think if you go back and you look at the history of the Washington Post, the history of the New York Times, the history of the Wall Street Journal, you will find strong conservative, isolationist trends in this news. And so you have to sort of trace through the history of journalism to sort of, and the history of the profession, to start to explain what bias might be, or how you come to make accusations of bias in the news. So it's a really complicated question that we devote entire courses to some degree. But I would agree with Charlie that I'm not sure it's 100% accurate. Now, if you want to have a different question about why the New York, yeah. No, the funny thing about Americans is that Yahoo in that graph was in the center. Yahoo's an aggregator. They don't produce any original coverage. So, it's sort of,
I would say, and I think there's more wisdom in this room actually to answer that question. I would ask Dan Hallen. What's the story, Dan? And why are all these European papers left of center? Is that?
Well, it sounds like you're not saying why is news in general.
Oh, hold on. What? Yeah.
It sounds like you're not saying why is news in general left of center, which it obviously isn't, but why are the good newspapers left of center? Maybe that's just you think
that's
they're
what I
good
heard
because,
too. Yeah.
But it seems to me, a couple of things I would say about that. A lot of these are media that are based in big urban centers, and given the way right and left are defined these ways, those are liberal places. Their readers are liberal people in the sense we define it now. The other thing about those newspapers is that journalists have more autonomy at them, I would say, collectively. They are more journalist-oriented media, and perhaps that's why we consider them, those two things may be connected. Those are just a couple of thoughts about it.
Yeah. No, I sort of called on you out of the blue, so thank you. We had other questions. You had one, yes. Middle right here. Woman. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes.
Hi. My name is Jen Brandel. I used to be a journalist, and I now run a company called Harkin that serves newsrooms. I'm not in academia, but I'm always fascinated by the white papers that drop and try to make time to look at them. One of the things I've been wondering about is some of the structures in place in academia that keep some of this knowledge trapped into whether it's a journal or researchers aren't able to show their work as they go and get feedback in a public way. I feel like I'm always eager to know more of the process around how this stuff is working, be able to see it as it's going, but it sounds like there's danger to getting tenure if you publish something here or there first. And are any academic institutions moving to change some of these rules that feel kind of outdated in a world where transparency is more valued?
That's a great question, Jen. I guess from my perspective, I would say the universities that I'm familiar with, no, not really. And the difference is that some, and perhaps London School is this way as well because you have a professor of practice designation. So some schools, like the School of Journalism at Oregon, they do have these designations for people who are more on the practice and professional side. And there is a way in which one can earn tenure that doesn't rest so much on scholarly research. But then that introduces all kinds of confusion, right? Like nobody really knows who's doing what. Anyway, we could have an hour-long conversation about that. But I think that in general, it's not an overstatement to say that there are no respected academic journals in which this kind of work can be published. And so you're really forced to, do center reports and public-facing publications and blog posts and Medium and all of those kinds of things to get your knowledge out there, which you want to do if you care about, right, the state of journalism and democracy. So I think you've identified a huge problem. I don't see a whole lot of shift going on from my perspective.
But to push back on this, there is some danger to putting out research prior to peer review. Because I actually think the Oxford Internet Institute report on computational propaganda is a really good example of this. The methodology used to select what were classified as junk news is the kind of methodology that should have gone through peer review, so you could understand why certain categories were assigned to junk news. I have a lot of friends that work at the New York Daily News who were surprised to wake up to find that they were categorized as junk news. But the same thing as well with some of the political communication kind of research, where making sure that those statistical methods really do make sense for the questions that you're asking. And so there's these two things happening, the first of which is academia sort of moving towards open publishing, and that's hard, but the pressure to counter this crisis of expertise is producing research that's coming out before it's necessarily baked. So that's the sort of flip side of it.
Other questions? Yes, right there, yeah. Okay, and this will be the last one, so apologies for that, but go ahead.
Okay.
Make it a good one.
My name is Sylvia Albert. I'm working for a German public service broadcaster and doing research at the University of East London. So I'm also teaching journalists in data and in things like search engine optimizations. And I think now we have some kind of collaborations going on between some departments and academia, but not too much in the field of journalism itself. There is some kind of collaboration between science journalism and academia, and between the technological departments and academia. But I'm thinking, media companies, they grow more complex. So do you have any kind of strategy or advice for media companies to work together with academia in special fields, like new fields like data journalism, etc.? These are areas where people work together without a journalistic background. They don't have any knowledge about ethics, etc. I'm just a little bit wondering if these kind of things are going on.
I think that certainly the centers that we talked about earlier, I think are trying to bridge these gaps. Tau Center, Reuters, those places, I think are working very hard to kind of bridge those divides. So I think that's a strategy, right? One strategy is, spin off, sort of the Clayton Christensen, innovation strategy, right? If it's not working in the center, sort of spin something off that will, be able to do that type of collaboration more easily. I think that you do really need buy-in at a news organization. I think you need buy-in at the executive level to have a real strong collaboration. I don't think that you can just have a good collaboration that operates, at the level of the journalist or operates at the level of sort of company PR. So a lot of times I think news organizations see collaboration as mostly a PR strategy for them rather than actually trying to solve a problem. So I think that you want buy-in at the executive level. And the last thing I'd say is, and that's, I guess, is my final thought for the day, and I know that, a couple other people want to weigh in after me, but, we have to keep in mind that, academic research is not always going to be interesting to journalists. It's just not. And, or to academics, and, or to us. And you know what? But that's okay, right? That's not bad always, right? That, sometimes the things that they care about are just very different, you know, and you know, this is sort of Charlie's point, right? That, you know, why should anyone care about the fact that we're not collaborating as well? We should care, but we need to remember that, you know, like, we're not always, what we do is not always that interesting to journalists, and that's cool.
But Regina, I mean, the Engaged News Project, let's talk a little bit about the incredible level of partnership that you've been able to do, right?
Right, are you thinking of the Engaging News Project at UT, and then, you know, now has morphed into the Center for Media Engagement? I think that's a wonderful model, and it's the one that's the standout, I think, in this realm, where they really have partnered with all kinds of media organizations and tech companies to not just to fund the work, but to identify what are the research questions, but in a very collaborative way, so that the research is useful to the media companies, but also useful for those of us who care about journalism and want to, you know, build our understanding of how it works. So I do think that Center for Media Engagement is one model that I'm aware of in the US that is doing what you're talking about.
So, does anyone else on the panel want to sort of weigh in with final closing thoughts before we call it a session? Oh, right, you didn't hear me on the mic. Sorry. Boy, these mics. I mean, I'm loud, guys. You guys can hear me. Does anybody else on the panel want to weigh in with final closing thoughts? And if not, that's fine.
In this trust conversation that we're having, I think that it's really important for academics to participate, because we know a lot about social theories of trust. We also know why trust may not actually be the best thing to be talking about. So at least I encourage you, if you're having conversations about rebuilding trust in news, to check with your academics before you start going full-fledged.
I just want to say also, the miracle of this festival is manifold, but this is a great thing, and I think it's wonderful that these brilliant academics are here, and it's my job to say this, but it's to invite everybody to engage with these people, and with me, of course, you know, because I think there is a bit of a danger that perhaps the academics don't always say that they want to be involved, because many of them don't, and quite rightly and understandably, but some brilliant ones do, and they care about journalism as an object of study, but they actually, some of them care a little about it for its value to society as well. So I think it's fantastic that we've had this opportunity to engage, and I hope that people do.
Regina, anything close? All right, so that's it, guys. Thank you all for coming, and, you know, thanks.